It's like never having driven a car and immediately trying to drive a 18-wheeler from somebody's garage. They built it out of wood and PVC pipe, and trying to drive that through a mountain pass. Like, yeah, you might be okay, but it's probably a really, really bad idea. Are you a new Dungeon Master struggling to make it through a single session? In today's video, I'm gonna tell you the top 6 mistakes that new Dungeon Masters make and how to fix them so you can focus on actually enjoying the game and having fun with your friends. I'm the TheAlpineDM. Let's get to it. A huge mistake that new Dungeon Masters make is worrying too much about the rules and mechanics of the game.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
Although yes, it is important to have a basic understanding of the rules and how the game should kind of flow in the session, it should not be your prime focus by any means, especially as a new Dungeon Master. If you're a new DM, then chances are the people at your table are also probably pretty new. So they're not even gonna know if you make a mistake or you use a rule incorrectly. Besides, there is way too many rules for you to just sit down and read and try to memorize them. It's just not gonna work that way. What you should focus on instead is just telling a cool story with your friends and having fun. Because the more practice you have as a Dungeon Master, you're just gonna slowly learn more and more rules, and that's gonna layer on top of itself. You'll be expanding your vast library of knowledge. And if it makes you feel any better, I've been playing D&D for like 12 or 13 years, DMing for 5 or 6 of those, and I'm still constantly getting rules wrong. The best thing you can do if you don't know how a rule works is make a decision, take a note about it, and move on. Number 2 is taking things too seriously. When I was a newer Dungeon Master, I would have terrible anxiety for hours before a session, and after a session, I would replay things in my head over and over and over again, and wonder whether everybody hated me or if I was doing a terrible job, and I just wanted to be good. Ultimately, this overwhelming pressure that I put on myself was because I was taking it too seriously. On the internet, you might see a lot of people call this the Matt Mercer effect, but ultimately, it really just boils down to expectations at the table. The reality is that you are playing a game of imagination with your friends. Just imagine how ridiculous it would be if you took other games as seriously as you took dungeon mastering for D&D. I can't believe I messed up that sound effect for the cannon explosion. That is so embarrassing. Everyone was smiling and they said they had fun, but it just seems like people on the internet do way better at playing Risk than I do. Well, I think it's great to strive for the level of world building and role playing and immersion that they have on Critical Role. Absolutely do not use that as a standard that you must achieve. They are literally professional actors with an entire production staff behind them. The most important thing you need to remember when you're playing is to just have fun. If anyone gives you grief for not using crazy voices for every single NPC or for using chess pieces and a dry erase board instead of custom-made terrain for every single little battle, they can go kick rocks. They're not a good friend. You don't need them at your table. You don't need that kind of drama, ridiculous stuff anyway. The goal shouldn't be for you to emulate Matt Mercer. The goal should be for you to improve a little bit every single time. And yes, it's great to use them as guidelines for things to improve upon, but again, don't hold yourself to that as a standard. You're just setting yourself up for failure and crushing anxiety. Real quick, I just want to ask if you are enjoying this video, if you're finding it helpful at all, to please subscribe and maybe give it a thumbs up or send it to a friend. It helps the algorithm recommend this to other people who will find value from it, and it helps me pursue my dreams of being a full-time writer. Thank you so much. Back to it. The next huge mistake that new Dungeon Masters make is allowing homebrew content into their games. Now, you might be thinking, Aaron, you write and sell books that are full of homebrew content, to which I would say, yes I do, you're very observant, and you should go to the link in the description if you want to buy them. But in all seriousness, homebrew content is something that newer Dungeon Masters should avoid because the vast majority of it is completely untested and unbalanced and will cause way more headache and pain than it's worth, especially when you don't know the rules. Now yes, if you're buying something from an established creator such as Hit Point Press or Kobold Press or TheAlpineDM, for example, I don't know, then you probably have way less to worry about. But if a player comes to you with a custom summoner class that they found on the D&D wiki page, then you should absolutely not even consider letting them use it, especially if you're still watching videos with titles like "Dear New Dungeon Master, please stop doing this." And this is not meant to be mean or to stifle creativity, but it's literally because you do not yet have a full understanding of the rules and how they are intended to work and how they should work with each other. You just don't realize how much it could really mess things up and completely throw your game out of whack and out of balance. It's like never having driven a car and immediately trying to drive a custom-made 18-wheeler from somebody's garage. They built it out of wood and PVC pipe, and trying to drive that through a mountain pass. Like, yeah, you might be okay, but it's probably a really, really bad idea. Honestly, for your first campaign or first couple sessions as a dungeon master, you should force your players to stick to only options covered in the player's handbook. And there's 2 reasons for this. The first is because it helps reduce the amount of information that you need to loosely understand as a new dungeon master without worrying about whether it's balanced or any weird variant rules that don't necessarily come into play. And secondly, because if your players can't have any amount of fun without adding in spaceships and mana points and all this crazy stuff, then maybe D&D isn't necessarily for them. And that's not to say you can't ever add things like this in, and again, I would encourage everyone to use homebrew when you understand the rules of the game better. The next awful, terrible mistake that new dungeon masters make is trying to think that it's their job to beat the players. I think that this is such a fundamentally flawed approach to playing the game. You're the dungeon master, you're literally more powerful than gods. If you wanted to beat the players, you can just outright kill them. You don't need to do anything to do that. So that's it's a non sequitur. That's not your job. Your job as the DM is to be an architect who builds a framework for the players to become heroes with. So yes, certainly part of the job is to create challenging scenarios and traps and lethal encounters, but you're not trying to beat the players. Now, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed when I don't get to use a cool ability with a monster or when a players disarm a particularly devastating trap. But at the end of the day, I want to see the characters be heroes and succeed to some degree. They're not my characters by any means, but I've been with them as a dungeon master every single step of the journey. I've got to see them grow and face these challenges, and I want to see them become heroes and kill the fucking bad guys. Like, I don't get it. When terrible things happen to a party member and they might be facing life or death situation, it should not be up to the dungeon master to solely decide their fate. It should be decided by choices that players have made in the past and random dice rolls. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't test and challenge your players. You absolutely should. That is also part of your job as the dungeon master. And you don't want it to be an auto-succeed scenario or an auto-fail scenario. Leave the players some agency and see what they're going to do. You never know. They will constantly surprise you. The 5th mistake that new dungeon masters make is being way too rigid or inflexible with their players. In a lot of ways, prepping for a D&D session is like trying to read your player's mind and figuring out what actions they're going to take. In theory, this is great. You think that they're going to go into a cave the next session, so you prepare some cool cavernous descriptions and come up with monsters and an ambush and lots of treasure and loot. So it's going to be smooth sailing for the session, right?
Wrong.
In the session, the party decides they want to get some more intel on the mayor with a very punchable face. So instead of heading into the cave and cavern system that you have fully prepared, and that's the session you expected, they spend the entire session making fake mustaches and following the mayor around for his entire day or maybe even a week to see what he's getting up to. Now, this is where a lot of new dungeon masters might panic because you have absolutely no idea what the mayor does with his day, and you're not even remotely prepared to run that session. Now, in situations like this, it might be tempting to tell the players that they can't go do that and to kind of funnel them and railroad, this is where this term is coming from, railroad them to the session that you have prepared. But that is absolutely the worst thing you can do. You never want to take away player agency. It's the most amateur league BS that you can ever come up with. So here's what you do instead. Number 1, you say, I love your guys' idea, but honestly, I'm not really prepared for that session. So let's take a 5-minute break and I'll brainstorm some ideas so we can keep playing. Number 2, see if you can salvage anything from what you do have prepared. This isn't always going to be a one-to-one and you can't always make it work, but sometimes with some creative reskinning and minor tweaking, you can take what you already have prepared and kind of translate it to what the players intend to do. This doesn't always help, but it's worth checking at least. And 3, try your best and learn from your mistakes. Running a session with virtually nothing prepared is so nerve-wracking as a new dungeon master, but pushing through that discomfort is going to make you so much better in the long run. And besides, quickly thinking on your feet and adapting to unforeseen circumstances and player actions is a fantastic skill to have, not only as a dungeon master, but in real life. As you may or may not know, depending on how old you are when you watch this video, things happen in life that you can't control, and it's all about how you react to those situations. So this is just another way to practice that in a safe environment. Each time you do this, you'll become a little bit more comfortable with improvising a situation, and you'll be a way better dungeon master in the long run. As you continue to gain experience and do this, you'll eventually build up a backlog of details and scenarios in your dungeon master brain library that you can call upon in situations like this. So even though you don't have it prepared on paper, it can still be a pretty seamless and awesome session. The final mistake that new dungeon masters make is not reading the rule books at all. Now, at first glance, this might seem a little contradictory to my initial rule, but hear me out because it's not. Now again, I don't think anyone should sit down and try to read the rule books, the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master Guide, from front to back as though it's a novel, because that's absolutely psychotic, and why would you ever do that to yourself? But you should peruse it occasionally, or at least have a general idea of what's going on. Whenever a rules question comes up, instead of stopping and looking it up in the moment, make a decision, like I said previously, but write down that question, write down the rule, so that in your downtime later in the week, the night, whenever, you can look up the answer to that rule. Then in the future, when a similar question or when that rule comes up again, you'll either A, know the answer off the top of your head, or B, have a general idea of where to find that rule. Again, you're slowly building and layering up your knowledge of rules as a dungeon master. This is not gonna happen overnight. This will take a long time, so just go with it. Don't be the person who goes on Reddit and takes 4 paragraphs to ask, how do you calculate the attack bonus for a melee weapon? Because I feel like I see questions like this all the time, constantly, and it's laid out pretty straightforward in the book if you do read them. Again, like, don't stress and fuss over the rules, but, you know, read them a little bit. And I still wholeheartedly believe that as a new dungeon master, you should really just focus on telling a fantastical story with your friends and having fun, and enjoy the narrative and the combat and all of it, and rules come secondary. But that's not an excuse for you to just be an ignorant fool for the rest of your life. It's truly not. You should put in a little bit of effort. And this doesn't just apply to generic adventuring rules, but also class-specific abilities. Because whether you like it or not, players, especially if they're new, aren't going to understand their rules and abilities, and they're going to look to you, the dungeon master, for some guidance. So again, you don't need to memorize how every single subclass of barbarian works, but you should have a decent idea of how rage works as a mechanic. Again, you don't need to memorize it, but just be like, oh yeah, okay, they deal more damage, they have resistance to stuff, like loose, broad strokes, and then you just learn. Like I said, you learn over time. Not that difficult. That's what I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate you giving it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing to the channel, sending it to a friend. It really helps me grow, helps the algorithm get a little funky juice in its system, moving things along. Huge shout out and thank you to my patrons for making this video possible. You can see their list of names right here on the screen. That's where I'll be putting it in the post-production. So again, thank you so much, and if you're interested in buying any of my books, you're going to find the link in the description.